So you will have heard that the meeting's being recorded so that we can share this chat on the NP website. So we're here on Zoom together, and our event is also going out over Facebook Live. So hello to anybody watching through Facebook. Thanks for joining us. We'll give it one more minute just to allow the last few people to join in who are keen to get in right from the start. And then we'll get going. Thanks for your patience, everybody. One more minute and we'll get started. Wonderful to see familiar faces, long-term friends and colleagues in the NP world, and some new faces, people coming in from all over the place. Thanks for taking the time to be here today. Wonderful. Great. All right. Well, let's get started then. Folks can continue to join as they wish, but let's get started. And thanks to everybody who's here now. We've got lots to talk about. We want to make the most of our time that we have together. So we'll just jump right in. My name is Tiffany Eastham. I'm the Executive Director of Nonviolent Peace Force, and I am on this call with you from Geneva, Switzerland, where NP's international headquarters are. Many members of the NP HQ team are also on this call, and so they can introduce themselves in the chat window as well. And we're thrilled to be with you all here today. So again, we'll get started. We've got a really special opportunity today, a real unique opportunity to spend some time together with our like core founding family for Nonviolent Peace Force. We haven't had this group of people together to be able to have this kind of chat for a really long time. And so we're pretty excited to be able to hear from our speakers, to hear about the visions that they had for starting NP in the first place, some of the challenges and the hopes and dreams, and where do they see us going from here, from the work that we're doing now and where we're going from here, and the thoughts sort of where does the work of unarmed civilian protection, applied nonviolence sit in today's world? So great opportunity to hear from them. We'll have our speakers with us speaking for about 30 minutes, and then we'll wrap that up, and then we will open it up to questions from you all. So if there's stuff that you're thinking about, you'd like to hear more about, questions you'd like to ask our speakers, what we will end up doing is taking those questions in the chat window and getting our speakers to respond accordingly. It's always sometimes it's tricky to get to everybody, so we'll do our very best, and we'll go from there. So let's take it away. And before we get started, I just would like to really remind everybody who we've got in our speakers group today. I think for many people, you know our fine speakers, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, we have together today, we have Mary Lou Ott. If you can wave Mary Lou from your window. Mary Lou was our first person to join the co-founders of Nonviolent Peace Force. She served for many years as the director of NP's volunteers and local chapters in the US. We've also got David Hartsough with us today. Wave from your window, David, if you can. There he is. He's one of NP's co-founders and also served as NP's first strategic relations director and capacity building director. He is also the author of Waging Peace, Global Adventures of a Lifelong Activist. Mel Duncan, known by many, if not all, NP co-founder, NP's first executive director, and also served for many years as NP's director of advocacy and outreach with a special focus on the United Nations. We're also really grateful to have with us Tiff Toole. So there's two Tiffany's in NP, I am one, and Tiff Toole, so we call me Tiffany and her Tiff. She is currently a member of NP's board of directors. She also used to work with us in the field. She was in our South Sudan program as a protection officer and as a team leader. and she will be moderating the conversation between Mary Lou, David, and Mel. So without further ado, let me turn it over to you, Tiff, and invite everybody to enjoy this great conversation coming up.
Thank you, Tiffany. So Mary Lou, David, and Mel, we're so grateful for everything that you've done to create Nonviolent Peace Force, and that you can be here with us today. So there are three main questions I would like to ask you, and as an open dialogue between the three of you. As a reminder to all of the guests, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers afterwards as well. So the first question is, what does the future hold for unarmed civilian protection? The second question is, what are the biggest lessons that you've learned over the years? And lastly, the question, how do we reimagine and build a safe and more just world? I will also paste those questions into the chat. Starting with you, Mel, can you also set the stage for how NP started?
Sure, thanks, Tiff. First of all, I want to set it straight that while David, Mary Lou, and I are given credit for being co-founders, which we certainly did do a lot of work. I don't want to diminish that, but we were much more holders of the focus. This idea of a nonviolent peace army, a Shanti Sena, nonviolent peace force, had been a recurrent vision. And really, we see examples going back to several thousand years ago with Lokonat, a Buddhist diva, and moving through the centuries. I think it addresses to one of our archetypes. And so David and Mary Lou and I were much more holders of the focus, holding that focus, and the three of us do share a dogged persistence, so that other people could come together into that space who had the experience, the knowledge, the commitment, the money to make NP happen. And so as we came together, I think about, this goes deep into Mary Lou and David as well. I remember seeing Mary Lou in the late 1980s as part of a feminist peace group called Women Against Military Madness. She leading a group of women into the middle of a major street in Minneapolis and kneeling between the riot police and a group of anarchists who were demonstrating. And as I looked at that, I thought, there's something to that, because she and the other women stopped an entire phalanx of riot police. And David, of course, has been doing this work all his life. I think when I grabbed him at the Hague and said, if you're serious about what you just said, David's serious about everything he says. And your work in Central America, in the Philippines, in the 80s and 90s, doing what we now call unarmed civilian protection. And also more close to the time when you and I met, the time you spent in a Kosovo jail, thinking about what we needed to do there. So these are examples of our experience, our shared experience, that really came together to form Nonviolent Peace Force. And everyone on this call also has their own experiences that they bring to this effort. And many of those experiences have enriched us over the years. So David, would you start out by sharing some of your reflections?
Well, thank you, Mel. It's beautiful to see so many wonderful, beautiful faces out there from across the US and around the world. And I think I just want to say it was one of the most joyful times of my life when at the Hague Appeal for Peace, I put out that vision of a global nonviolent peace force. And Mel came up and says, I'm ready if you are. And I've spent 6 years sharing this vision with people around the country and around the world. And Mel seemed serious. And we got together, and look what we've got now, and we can be so grateful. I think these are very important questions that have been raised, and I'd like to just share a few reflections. In terms of the first couple of questions about the future of nonviolent peace force and unarmed civilian protection, it seems to me we need to choose conflict areas in which to work where ideally both sides in a conflict are committed to ending the violence and peacefully resolving the conflict, and invite NP to come to work. And that where the problem is the extremists on both sides that want to spoil the cake, so to speak. And the Philippines is an example where I met in the early days with both the vice chair of the Moral Islamic Liberation Front and with the vice president of the Philippines. And both of them said, we would love to have a nonviolent peace force come to be present to help make a real peace process possible here. But while that would be the ideal situation, I think we also need to respond to requests from countries where there are nonviolent movements and/or civilian populations whose lives are endangered. That could be places like Palestine or Burma or Kosovo back in 1999 when I met Mel. Second suggestion, I think we need to identify the peacemakers and the human rights workers in areas of conflict and take the cues from them, what is needed to achieve peaceful resolution and protect them. And I think Guatemala is an example where when there was genocidal violence happening back in the early 80s, and a few Peace Brigades International people were there, there was a group called Mothers of Peace. Mothers of the Disappeared. And 2 of their leaders were killed. And the other leaders came to Peace Brigades International and said, we can't be silent, our pain is too great, but we must continue to speak out, but can you come and accompany us so we're not also killed? And that was, and Peace Brigades International did accompany those leaders. None of them were killed, and their courage gave courage to others throughout that society to begin speaking out and acting, and led to the beginning of a democratic society. I think we need to pick some areas of conflict very much in the news, and through our work on the ground, show the power and effectiveness of UCP, of unarmed civilian protection. So people and governments, the UN and the whole world, can see the effectiveness and power of UCP. And a result, there's much greater financial support for NP and vastly increasing nonviolent peace force work in even more conflict areas and war zones around the world. A fourth reflection, I think we need an emergency response network where we could have a large pool of nonviolent peace workers trained and prepared to go into conflict areas on short notice, so the nonviolent peace force can respond to the needs and requests in a timely manner before the conflict gets too ingrained and the world's attention is still on it. For example, Haiti or Palestine, Israel, or Kosovo back in 1999, where there was ethnic cleansing going on, and there was a very powerful nonviolent movement. And President Clinton at the time said, we have two choices. We can look the other way and do nothing, or we can go in and start bombing. And those of us that knew that situation knew that there was a third alternative, and that was sending many international nonviolent peace force people into that conflict to make it possible for that nonviolent movement to be successful. And I think if that had happened, we would not have had the continuing hatred that will continue for generations. And a vision for the nonviolent peace force that we have thousands, we now have hundreds, which was the first part of our vision, but the vision for thousands of trained nonviolent peacekeepers in multiple conflict areas around the world. And the UN and the governments and UN agencies request NP workers to work in those areas of conflict. And on the third question, about how do we build a more safe and more just world, I have also a couple of reflections. I think we need to help the world see the power of unarmed civilian protection and nonviolent peacemaking as more powerful and effective than armed intervention or bombing or threats of nuclear war or sending in the Marines. The trillions of dollars the world spends on armaments and preparation for wars would instead go for improving the lives of people all over the world. We could end starvation and hunger, build health clinics, send thousands of Peace Corps people all over the world, and fully fund the Nonviolent Peace Force and UCP. Just 3% of the US military budget could end starvation in the whole world. How much more secure we would be. The concept of national security would be outmoded. Instead, we would work for shared security or common security for all people and all nations. All nations would join the international treaty to ban nuclear weapons. There's such tremendous danger of nuclear war today, especially between the US and China and Russia, which could end human life on our planet. This is so critical. So if we all joined the international treaty to ban nuclear weapons, this would be a massive step forward. We should end the arms race, the arms trade. And we could start by ending the sale or giving weapons to any government who are committing human rights abuses or are at war with their own people or for fighting wars with other nations. We need to overcome nationalism, the idea that our country is better, more important than other nations. We are all one human family, and our loyalty is to the whole human race. We would have fair trade between rich nations and poor nations. We would stop the flow of dollars and resources from poorer nations to richer nations. We would share the vaccines for the virus among the whole world, and keeping them, instead of keeping the mass majority for the rich nations. We would develop a stronger UN with a global nonviolent peace force, which would be available to send into conflict areas to protect civilians and support peaceful resolution of conflict. This would be an alternative to, or in addition to the blue helmets, thousands of unarmed civilian protectors who could go into conflict areas like in Kosovo that I mentioned in 1999. So thank you. I'm glad to be a part of this conversation. And it's so beautiful to see our vision of a nonviolent peace force growing all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
David.
David. And I also want to
True.
thank you for laying out a vision for what could happen. And it reminds us of all the work that we have to do, all of us. And also when you mentioned the beauty of seeing everyone on Zoom, you know, it's really moving to be here in this context and be able to connect with one another. And my experience is pretty, and my vision, I think, is pretty humble compared to what I was listening to you share, because it comes out of my experience of being, frankly, a family. And that word was mentioned in the very beginning, I think, by Tiff. But I do think NP is a family, and that is what attracted me and kept me going. And at my experience started years before I joined Mel. And it came out of my husband and I have a big family. And our first 6 children were boys, our boys. And we'd look at those little boys and there was no way on earth we were going to raise those children to go to war and kill some other mother's baby. And so our whole life in raising our kids was focused on that idea of nonviolence. I mean, from the time those boys were little until they grew up, and today it's the same. And with my grandchildren and great-grandchildren, it's the same. And sometimes I think they get a little tired of hearing from me, but I believe that's my job and my family to do that. And so when that brought me out on the streets, it brought me into the Catholic worker movement. It brought me into the women's movement. And all my life, I've been privileged to be a volunteer, which I believe is a privilege that most people are not able to do. And so when Mel called and he came home from meeting you and talked to different people, and he called, we sat down with a group, Mel and his wife Georgia and a few other people, for lunch, and he shared his ideas, his vision. It was like a light went on in me. And that's what I wanted to give the rest of my focused volunteer work to do, to begin to build a nonviolent peace force. And so I just said to Mel, who's helping you? What are you doing? And nobody at that point in the practicalities of office work. So that's how come I got to go in on the ground floor. And it has been a joy and a privilege all my life. So when we talk about what is the future, I look back and think, what is the legacy that we're leaving for those wonderful young people all over the world that are doing the work now? And we are the roots. We are the legacy, and we worked very hard to build the peace force based on some very important values, and that I see expressed in what I read and who I talk with in the peace force, and the work that's being done from Myanmar to Minneapolis. And it really starts with valuing one another as persons. And that's what we did. And we built a foundation. We went to the Nobel Peace Prize people and asked them to endorse us. And then we began to do what you suggested, David. We did do that in the beginning. We reached out to groups, NGOs, and peace groups all around the country and other countries. A lot of it was done by the travels and work of you and Mel, most of it actually. And we connected with people. And everybody that we connected with was excited about this idea. And to me, the foundation of it was built on trust, on the ability to listen to others, on the ability to forgive and to try new things, And for that, I can see the growth of the Peace Force. And Mel, why don't you chime in on this idea of how you feel about seeing what you see now? I'm not in the trenches now. I'm retired, so to speak. I mean, I love to listen to what is happening now. So why don't you maybe pick up a little bit and share what I've just started or said?
Thanks, Mary Lou. I want to be clear that I think Nonviolent Peace Force would have been on the scrap heap of ideals if Mary Lou hadn't have stepped in and really put things together and ran the office and what we needed to do, including looking after the money. You know, some of my reflections, and I'll start from going back, but moving forward and sharing those reflections that still are relevant to me. The first one I mentioned earlier about that we were tapping into a recurrent vision. When we were talking about this idea of nonviolent, unarmed civilian peacekeepers working with local people caught up in violent conflict to provide protection and prevent violence, there was a resonance that we would pick up from people often. And they really formed the core of the people that shaped Nonviolent Peace Force. And so it was this recurrent vision. A second lesson that we learned fairly early in Sri Lanka that still is very relevant today is the significance of local people in their own protection. When we were first starting on this, one of the terms that was used to describe this work was third-party nonviolent intervention, TIPNI. And in fact, the real sustainability of this work lies in local people learning to protect themselves and to support one another in doing so. And so, for example, now in Mindanao, where we've been since 2007, the entire group of unarmed civilian protectors are local people. And people running the project are local people. And that's really an important key to sustainability, because another lesson that I learned is that these kinds of entrenched violent conflicts go on for a long time. It is not an in and out. If you would have told me in 2010, when we were doing the assessment of whether we could work in what was then called Southern Sudan, that we would still be there in 2021, I wouldn't have believed you. But that these are ongoing conflicts, and so that we need to support and at times train local people so that they are better able to protect themselves. And it's really not a matter of capacity building, as it is capacity recognition, in recognizing the abilities of people who are there and have worked and have the wisdom of that area, and then supporting and enhancing that if needed. I've also came away, David shared the vision about 2,000 unarmed civilian protectors. And I think when we first laid this out there, we thought we could do that in 3 years. And now we're at about 300. So we miscalibrated a bit on that. But first of all, most of the wars that are happening today are not country versus country, but are internal wars. And even when they are large scale, for example, in Iraq and in South Sudan, the work of unarmed civilian protectors is done much more by smaller groups in multiple locations, rather than a large group amassed on a field to take on a army that's on the roll. It's much more localized, as the violence is much more localized. I've also learned that a key element of our ability to protect is relationships. That building those relationships and maintaining them is critical to our ability to protect and prevent violence. And that means relationships with people that we don't especially like, with people we don't agree with. I can remember having a conversation very early on with one of the leaders of the Tamil Tigers. I certainly disagreed with everything he was doing, but we needed to establish a relationship so they knew who we were, what we were doing, and how we could stay in touch with each other. So that relationships, and related to that, the nonpartisanship, that by us not going in and picking a side has enabled us to provide much broader protection. For example, in Mindanao, where we were invited by both the government of the Philippines and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front to play a major role in the ceasefire. Another thing that has always just amazed me is how many people want to do this work. We recently read an ad saying that you'll live either in a tent or a cinder block building. You will walk sometimes up to 8 miles a day. There will be no running water, no electricity. And I just kind of laughed. I thought, I'm not sure I'd want to hire someone who would want that job. Well, we had more people applying than we could handle. And that's been the case throughout our history. I think it's also important to not lose sight of emphasizing nonviolence. Nonviolence is critical to our work. And it really defines the paradigm shift, the larger work that we're involved in, providing concrete evidence that violent conflict can be met with nonviolent means, even when there's all kinds of guys with automatic weapons standing there, that those kinds of conflicts can be met with unarmed civilian protectors. David mentioned about the UN, and I spent 6.5 years representing us at the UN, and understand the limits much better than when I started. Gandhi once said, first they laugh at you, no, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. And when David and I first went to the UN, there were only 5 people who would even see us. And so we were not exactly ignored, but kind of patted on the head and patronized. That, of course, works with a few human rights defenders in Guatemala, but there's no policy implications here. And that moved into really, people weren't laughing, but they were treating us as kind of a boutique operation. And then we got a big break when a international group that was reviewing all UN peace operations recommended that unarmed approaches must be at the forefront. And then people started fighting us because they felt threatened. And so we went through that period of sharp elbows and being excluded, and we kept at it. And finally, we're at a point now where at least parts of the UN, even the Department of Peace Operations, are recognizing and supporting our work because they see that in their analysis that in certain areas that we're much more effective than they can be. Just a couple more things very quickly. I am heartened by the number of groups that are doing this work. We've been engaged in a good practices process, and we have found that there are over 50 groups that are doing some form of unarmed civilian protection or accompaniment in 26 places. And that number is growing, and I'm sure there are more than 50. And it's not growing because anybody's out there organizing to do this. It's growing because local people are realizing their power, realizing their ability, and standing up and to do this. Just a couple more insights. We have learned that we have to integrate climate disruption into our work, that climate disruption and violent conflict are deeply connected, and every conflict we're in has a climate dimension that's exacerbating the conflict. And so we have to become more involved in how we integrate climate change, environmental work, and unarmed civilian protection. And finally, we're going in a direction. We certainly haven't been 100% successful. We've had setbacks. It's not a linear story, but we are illuminating a new story. And we're doing that as we continue in our joint work. We need to keep struggling and keep experimenting until the Uyghurs are not alone, until the Rohingya are not forced into mass atrocities and forced into camps in Bangladesh, until Afghan women can walk with dignity and not fear being tortured or killed. We have a lot of work to do. We need to keep challenging each other and growing and supporting this growth, not only in NP, but in lots of other groups.
Thank you, Mel. Thank all of you, David, Mel, and Lou, for your wisdom, your reflections, the inspiration. You know, David having this idea with Mel, Mary Lou getting the boots on the ground and really pushing the organization, and Mel for carrying us to where we are today. If it was for the three of you, none of us would be here on this call right now. And you know, I'm proof that we can do this because I have been able to go on the ground as a protection officer and make these connections and see and be a part of the work that we've done. It's a long game. It takes a very long time to build these relationships through the communities. You know, as Mel already mentioned, everyone has the capacities, and it's just amazing to watch and see and be a part of this. And it's really wonderful to honor this past and look to the future of NP. You know, now we're a very diverse organization. We have staff from over 35 countries across the globe in the work that we're doing. So thank you again for this wisdom, and I will pass it to you, Tiffany.
Great. Well, thanks for everything. We've heard from our speakers, and thanks, Tiff, for adding in your perspective. So we've got a little bit of time if anybody has some questions. We've been getting a few questions while the speakers have been chatting, so we'll start with those. But if you do have questions you'd like to make, go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. So the first one is written here in the chat, or came from John. Let's go to my notes. John Fairfield. He said, I'd like to hear about unarmed, nonviolent crisis intervention teams that respond to emergency calls, even when there are weapons and violence involved, with no police involvement or backup. Is anyone aware of any? From our speakers, who would like to take that one? Mel, David? Yeah.
John, I think you're describing what is often done in South Sudan, especially with our mobile units, who do respond exactly as you're saying when there are threats and incursions to people, often in very remote areas, by well-armed factions, whether they be state or non-state actors. And we do respond. There are no police there. We're there, and we're there with the skills and the understanding and the belief that this works. In the United States, I think that there's a few examples. The first one that comes to mind is Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon, where they respond to many calls that have been traditionally looked upon as the domain of the police, and they do it unarmed, without police, for mental health issues, chemical abuse issues, domestic abuse issues, and a variety of other things where even 911, when they get a call like that in Eugene, they route it to Cahoots. It doesn't even go to the police. And we're seeing examples now in Minneapolis where neighbors are organizing. Part of this is being supported by the Service Employees International Union, which is primarily a Black and brown union, of supporting community safety specialists who can intervene in community problems. And their goal is to intervene before the police are called. So there's a number of examples of that being done.
There's one other example in Bougainville in the Pacific, off the coast of New Zealand, where there'd been massive fighting going on for years, and the New Zealand Army, the government of New Zealand decided to send the army, but unarmed, to help support a peace process there, supported by the Maori, the native people of New Zealand, and were successful. A film has been made about that experience called Soldiers Without Guns, which I highly recommend to people. And they say that if they'd gone in with guns, it would have just multiplied the killing by everyone.
Thanks, David. We have a few questions I'll try and group together. There's a lot of interest in our work in the US. So of course, we've had NP staff in the US since NP began, but it's only quite recently that we've started substantively programming in the US. So we like to call USA NP's newest country program. So there's some questions sort of about what does that work look like? How do we deal with sort of the extreme polarization and the strong separation of groups? What does that look like for dealing with people who sit on what identify as being far right in the US? And really looking for ideas about catalyzing change as it relates to identity. A lot of the work that we're doing is with communities, BIPOC communities, where violence is being meted out by people who look a lot like many of us on this call. And what are our thoughts around that? So maybe I could ask you, Mel, to kick that off, because you've been so integral in kicking off our US programming.
Yes, and it's very, very exciting. In terms of the question of people who look like us on the call, all of the people hired for the US program are people of color. And a lot of the people who are going through training are also people of color. Some examples of the work that we're doing in New York recently, we trained a group of New Yorkers to provide protection to the march by transgender people in June. We've also responded to the attacks on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders by providing probably now a dozen trainings around the country for people in that community on self-protection. In Minneapolis, a couple of the things that we've done is when the Minneapolis School Board voted not to rehire police to be in the public schools, they told the safety and security department of the schools to hire security specialists without any idea of what those people would do. And so we were hired actually to train them so that they can deal with conflicts and do violent prevention and community building in the schools without guns. And Minneapolis has a goal that within 5 years, all conflicts within a very large school district, 35,000 students, will be handled nonviolently. One other example, we've worked in providing training and support to a group of young men who either were in gangs or are vulnerable to gangs, in how unarmed civilian protection can be applied in their neighborhood in North Minneapolis. And this has led to some very interesting things. For example, community patrolling on the nights leading up to and the night that Derek Chauvin was sentenced, being done by these young people primarily. And now 5 of them have been hired to work as unarmed security for a local parochial school, and they're getting living wages and benefits for doing unarmed civilian protection in their community. Wow. So those are some examples of what's happening in the US.
Thanks, Mel. We saw there's been some comments, and more comments than questions, really emphasizing the importance of women in the process, the inclusion of women in peace processes and violence reduction processes at all levels. And I'm wondering if maybe Mary Lou, given all of your experience that Mel introduced us to, wanted to make some comment about that.
Well, yes, thank you, Tiffany. When Mel was talking about our people that have been hired here in the US, we had a picnic in early spring, and an NP picnic for people in the community of St. Paul, Minneapolis area. And all of these young people were there. And really, I had a hard time containing my joy, because they were mostly women, a couple of, not all, but a few men, young men too, but all people of color. And what a joy, because that to me is an outcome of the beginning of the early vision. And to see it happening, and to see it happening in my own city, sadly, but gladly, that we're able to accomplish it. I am really pleased. And I know when I look at the statistics for NP, am I right in saying that it's about equal between women and men? That's terribly important in today's world, and noticeably so. So thank you everyone for that.
Thanks, Mary Lou. And I would really say that women's participation in peace and security is one of our core focuses. We call it a core competency in the work that we do. Many of you will have heard stories about the women's protection teams that are working in different country programs where we're located, where women are really taking on leadership roles in the communities in peace and security. And we think about it really from an inclusivity perspective. Is in order to achieve sustainable peace, it's not just women, it's not just men, it's not just youth, it's not just persons of particular ethnicities. inclusivity is critical. We need to work together we are so interdependent and mutually reliant on each other to be collectively safe. So it's about intentionally creating space for those who are frequently marginalized from that space, and that often, among other groups, does include women. So it's a real focus of the work that we do. I think we've got time for maybe one more comment. And David, I'm going to come back to you. Again, there's so many questions around as it relates to the US, but certainly in other parts of the world as well, really about this issue around real meaningful change. This is, as you've all said, is a long game. We can want change to happen, but just thinking about it and wanting it is not enough. We roll up our sleeves and we do it generation to generation. Mm-hmm. And given your experience, really active experience in the civil rights movement in the US, and looking through where we are today, maybe you could help wrap us up with just some your reflections on what it means to work for that kind of change and what you would encourage us all to do to take forward wherever we are in the world.
Well, that's a real easy question. Well, I think obviously it's a long-term struggle. And I think just a couple of reflections on that question. I think one, the freedom movement, as we called the civil rights movement in the 60s, I think the discipline of nonviolence was absolutely critical. And what we were able to do in really touching the hearts and consciences of the American people to stop their complacency about the violence and the oppression and the injustice that was happening to people of color by people just steadfastly speaking out and acting to go and vote, and even when they were beat up by billy clubs and police dogs, etc., continuing that struggle, I think touched the hearts and consciences of the American people, and we got a voting rights bill and we got a civil rights bill. And it's that kind of sustained, nonviolent struggle that is needed today. And I would like to say that I think, to me, one of the most hopeful things is that people all over the world are discovering the power of active nonviolence and nonviolent movements. As Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan point out in their study, over 100 years, the nonviolent movements have been over twice as likely to be successful as violent movements. Mm-hmm. And that's very, very hopeful. It's not just a few of us that are involved in this struggle. And I think the other comment that I would like to make is I think we need to hold up the examples of cahoots in Eugene and of what's happening in the Twin Cities now in terms of unarmed civilian protection. And I mean, there's no reason that every city in the United States couldn't be doing something similar. Mm-hmm. And I think the final thing I'd say is this is a long-term struggle. And I think war, the whole idea of war and violence and threatening even more violence or even nuclear war is an insane and stupid way of resolving conflict. And I'm also the co-founder of another organization called World Beyond War. Mm-hmm. And we have people in over 100, I think it's 145 countries around the world that are working globally to try to stop that institution of war. And I think of Eisenhower, who certainly knew war, but he said some very wise things at the end of his life. And he said, I'd like to believe that the people of the world want peace so much that the governments will have to get out of the way and let them have it. And I think that's our responsibility as concerned citizens. And I say citizens not only of the United States, but of the world, to say we've had enough of this nonsense. There are better, more moral, more effective ways of resolving conflict and of achieving security. I mean, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and Vietnam, all these places certainly have not have achieved security for anyone. We just kill millions of people. We spend trillions of dollars, so we don't have the money to meet needs in our own societies. So I'm so grateful and inspired by all the people on this call that I know that are doing everything that you can, that we can, to help make the Nonviolent Peace Force an even more powerful force in the world, an example of a different way to protect people in the 80% of people are getting killed in conflict areas, and also to point a better way for resolving conflict.
Amen.
And putting an end to war. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, thanks so much, David. And thanks to all of our speakers for this great contributions. And we also, there's so much more we could talk about, the real importance about local ownership, local initiatives. When we talk about the work that we do, we mean the collective we, not just NP staff who are the foreign staff. We're talking about all of us together collectively. The best work is done by closest to the problem, those most impacted by violence, making the choice that they want to build the peace that they want in their communities, and then all the rest of us supporting that space. So we always need to remember that working together is that really radically centering those who are most impacted in everything that we do, and our role as support functions. So thank you so much. There's up in the chat box, you're going to see we've got one more thing to happen. I'm just going to turn it back over to Tiff to make final comments. We've got in the chat box, you'll see a link to a survey. If you've got time and you'd be willing to do so, we'd love to have you fill out the survey. We get your feedback on these calls, helps us continue to work on them and improve them. There's also a link to a resource list there. If you want to learn more, you can certainly click on that list. So Tiff, I turn it back over to you to wrap us up and bring us on home.
Thank you, Tiffany. This has been really, truly inspirational, and it's so good to hear from you. I've witnessed the lasting impacts of Nonviolent Peace Force as a former protection officer and a current board member in the way we work to protect civilians. And I continue to see the amazing work regularly in Myanmar, the Philippines, Iraq, South Sudan, the US, and the global work. For the past 6 years, I've donated funds to support this work, and I invite you also to do the same. Even a small monthly donation adds up and has long-lasting, huge impacts for the programs that we have, and supports the work of over 300 protection staff working in our different programs around the globe. So I invite you to join me in honoring the past and looking to the future of NP. There are many ways to give, either by one-time donation, monthly donations, peace bonds, stocks or planned gifts, and many other ways. I will put the link in the chat on donating. And lastly, And what I believe is most importantly, share what we're doing with your peers. If you have friends, family, colleagues, anyone who might be interested in our work, spread the word, and feel free to reach out to me and anyone in NP if you have questions. Thank you again so much, David, Mel, and Mary Lou, and everyone for joining us. One family, and hope to see you again.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for your time, your energy. We will see you at the next Nonviolence Cafe.
Amen.